turned it off earlier, but okay, so let's start again. Deja vu. Good morning. I am Molly Brinkerhoff, today's worship associate. I'm glad you're all here in the sanctuary, and as well as all the others that are watching us virtually. And we do have about 3 people that are doing that. We know you come here for different reasons: to find community, to seek to seek your spiritual and personal truths, to question, to nurture your heart and soul, to be nurtured, to explore new ideas, to find comfort, and perhaps to find the answers to some of your bigger questions. We welcome you. We know you come from different places, different religions, different beliefs, and different backgrounds. We hope you will find comfort, connection, challenge, and love here. We hope you will find ways to provide outreach to others in our Unitarian Universalist Church in Idaho Falls, in our local community, and in our world community. Before we get started, there unfortunately are, as always, a few announcements. First, silence your phones if you haven't already done that. If you're watching us virtually, if you are able, please sign into the chat box so we can see who is joining us. We will be having joys and concerns and sorrows today, and if you are here in the sanctuary, our greeter has a form, so if you'd like to fill that out, and we'll pick it up when joys and concerns comes up. If you haven't already sent them via email, those who are out there virtually, please post them in the chat box. This Friday was supposed to be game night. There will be no game night this month. Is that true? This month, right. Philosophical Society will be on January 25th at 7 o'clock here at the church, if you're interested. If you have any questions, please let Josh know. The technician back there, or Catherine. The MLK, the Martin Luther King banquet is coming up next Friday. We have a table, and we need, next Thursday. I stand corrected. We need 2 more people to complete our table, so if you're interested, let Victoria know. You too. Or me, I guess, either one of us. So, and then we have one last announcement that our board president, Victoria McDonald, will share with us.
Good morning. I'm glad to see you here. It was a rather dangerous morning, I thought. So, following the bylaws of our church, the UUCIF annual congregational meeting will be held on January 22nd, that's next Sunday, after the regular Sunday service. We encourage all members to attend in person to facilitate active discussion, but even more importantly, we need a quorum. So when we vote, it passes and we don't have to wait for another year. These are easy, these are not particularly controversial bylaws, I don't think. We will not be voting remotely this year via voting tokens as we have in the past. A link will be sent out to those who request by January 20th, that's Friday, to attend via Google Meet. Those attending via Google Meet will need to vote by voice or hand raise. The board has proposed bylaw changes to be voted on at the meeting and can be reviewed at proposed bylaw changes Article 2 and 4, and I believe that was sent out in an email. So please read them so you know what we're voting on. They're fairly simple. There's one page that shows all that's been deleted. I believe Larry Frank did that all. And then another page that shows how they will look, corrected version. A proposed budget will be sent out in advance of the meeting and will be available at the meeting. Please look at that carefully. This is very important for our next year's functioning. And we'll have printed reports also available at the meeting. For questions, additional information, or to request a meet Google Meet link for remote attendance. Contact Victoria McDonald at president@idahofallsuu.org. And I have to tell you that Google Meet is my nemesis. And so I have had people help me. I'm best friends with a computer company, and I still fail. But anyway, I will do the best I can. So the agenda for next week is we'll have church, and then we have like a 15 or 20-minute break to go downstairs, grab a cup of coffee, tea. There will be snacks so that you can hold on for maybe another hour or so for an annual meeting. However, I would ask that you not bring your snacks upstairs. And if you bring coffee to keep you awake, please bring a closed cup. But I also have found paper cups downstairs with lids on them, because this sanctuary is in very good shape, and I would like to maintain that. Thank you. Go ahead. What? Yeah, I'm sorry. Yep. Little food. I'm going to bring cookies, which we're not supposed to eat, of course, because we're all trying to eat healthy. But healthy foods would be good if possible. So, thanks.
So now, with that all said, we will now move into our sacred time of worship. So, settle yourself. Put your shoulders down, relax. Take several deep breaths as I ring the gongs 3 times. We will begin our service with our prelude. Our covenant, along with our 7 Unitarian Universalist principles, is our guide to how our congregation will relate to each other and the world. As I read our church covenant for us all, please join me and recite it with me. That is in your order of service. Love is the spirit of this community, and service its law. This is our great covenant to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. We will now be lighting our chalice. Those of you at home, if you have a candle or chalice available, please light it with us. So this is a chalice lighting by Paul Spector. We light this chalice to honor the memory of those who have come before us, kindling flames of wisdom in dark times, willing to challenge orthodoxy even at great personal risk, giving us a legacy of freedom and a love of truth, a legacy that warms our hearts and lights our paths.
Good morning. Our call to worship this morning is the poem, I Too Sing America by Langston Hughes. I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes. But I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America. I invite you now to rise in body or spirit and join in singing our opening hymn, number 169, We Shall Overcome.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we'll walk hand in hand someday. We shall all be free. We shall all be free. We shall all be free someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall all be free someday. We shall live in peace. We shall live in peace. We shall live in peace someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall live in peace someday.
For Time for All Ages, I have a book titled Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Starts out with black and white photos and ends up in color. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a leader in the civil rights movement. In the 1950s and 60s, he led millions of Americans to find peaceful ways to fight for equality. Americans honor his life and his work each year on the third Monday of January. Martin Luther was born January 15th, 1929. He grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, and became a minister like his father. During King's life, is this the next page? Yeah. During King's life, African Americans had fewer rights than whites. And I know for a lot of us we know the story, but I think it never hurts to remember. Southern states had segregation laws. Blacks and whites could not use the same schools, bathrooms, or other public places. King led peaceful protests against these laws. The largest protest was the March on Washington. And that happened in 1963, where King helped lead the march. More than 250,000 people came to show their support for equal rights. At this march, King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. He dreamed of a country where everyone was treated equally. And when I taught English in a high school in Alaska, one of the requirements was that children could listen to they listened to Dr. King's speech. And of course, some of the young girls wept because we realized what the inequality was. But you can go onto YouTube and you can listen to that same speech. YouTube says one of them is 32 minutes long, another one's 17. I think it's maybe 5 or 6. It goes so rapidly. The language he used is unbelievable, and I would really recommend, if you don't have a friend, go somewhere and listen to that speech on their computer. There were even laws stating that blacks and whites had to drink from separate drinking fountains. And this is a picture of a young black man drinking out of looks like a big tin water container that's labeled colored. It's hard to see. The March on Washington convinced Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act in 1964 that outlawed segregation. President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the act into law, but King did not see all the results of his work. He was assassinated April 4th, 1968. Efforts to make a holiday honoring King began 4 days after his death. U.S. Congressman John Conyers of Michigan introduced a bill to create a national holiday. Lawmakers voted against it. Some didn't want a holiday for a private citizen. Others didn't think King deserved a holiday. Coretta Scott King didn't want people to forget her husband. She planned the first event to celebrate his birthday in 1969. 4 years later, Illinois made Martin Luther King Day a holiday. It was the first state to do so, followed by Massachusetts and Connecticut in 1974. And here's Coretta Scott King standing in front of the statue of Abraham Lincoln that Martin Luther King stood in front of and gave his speech. In 1983, more than 500,000 people gathered in Washington, D.C. It was the 20th anniversary of the March on Washington. 6 million people had signed petitions asking Congress to make a holiday for King. The bill passed that year, and President Ronald Reagan signed it into law. The first National Martin Luther King Day was held January 20th, which will be Friday, 1986. Atlanta, Georgia had the biggest celebration. People came to march with the King family. Only 17 states held celebrations the first year, but by 2000, all 50 states did. Many schools and government offices are closed on Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Families celebrate by going to parades, picnics, and church services. Some cities have concerts and speeches honoring King. And I believe I heard something on the radio that there's going to be something going on tomorrow where people do social work. And here's the first color picture. I get kind of emotional about this. Here's this black people holding posters of Martin Luther King. And there's this handsome young black boy holding a sign that says, "I am the dream." King's life was spent serving others. To honor his work, a change was made to his holiday. Congress made it a national day of service in 1994. That's what I was talking about, that I've heard about happening here. Now, many volunteers spend the day helping out in their communities. King once said, "Everybody can be great because anybody can serve." People can honor King by serving others and fighting for equality. They can help those in need and clean up public places. People can speak up when others are being treated unfairly. They can continue the work of a man who died trying to make the world better for others. And here's some people working in a garden. So Rosie and I are going to be doing upstairs with the kids. Yeah. While you sing the exit song.
As we leave this friendly place, love give light to every face. May the kindness which we learn light our hearts till we return.
Felt, but it needs to be a little louder next time. I think we're a little weak on that, but okay. Joys and concerns. Ours is a welcoming community where we find connection, a spiritual community where we find meaning. Ours is a sharing community where our joys are amplified, a caring community where our sorrows are lessened. We take this moment to reflect on our joys and sorrows and acknowledge the mutual support of our community. I will now read the joys and concerns and sorrows we received, and Reverend Kevin will light a candle for each. The first one I want to have is for Vic, who is not feeling well, and we want to light a candle for him and hope he starts to feel better and will be back with us next Sunday. Pam has a joy. She'd like to welcome the newcomers Emily, Olivia, Adam, and Christian. So welcome. Kat Reese has a joy. She got to see swans at Harriman yesterday. That's always really cool. And she has a sorrow. Her husband's grandmother has stopped eating and is drinking for 4 days, and prayers to his family. So that's a struggle. Courtney has a joy. It is her 10-year anniversary of finding the UU Church. Thanks for being lovely people in my and Harmony's life. Great. We love having you here. Diana Klinger, she has a joy. Our daughter Addie is already happy and healing from getting some teeth pulled Friday. I saw a picture of that on Facebook. Not fun. But it was profitable for her from the Tooth Fairy. So there was a big joy there. Victoria McDonald she has a concern for Vic Allen's health as well. So let's all keep him in our thoughts. And that is it. So, and we light one more candle, in that we remember those who have spoken, those who we have named, and those we hold in silence in our hearts, and those things that we just can't share at this time.
Our reading this morning is from the book The Third Reconstruction, Moral Mondays, Fusion Politics, and the Rise of a New Justice Movement by the Reverend Dr. William Barber with Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove. When Jesus said, "Love your enemies," he wasn't simply stating a spiritual ideal to strive toward. He was also offering strategic advice for long-term success in any freedom struggle. Gandhi took the advice seriously and developed it into a philosophy of nonviolence, which came to America through the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 and 56. After a year of battle, which concluded with a Supreme Court decision ordering the integration of Montgomery's buses, Martin Luther King Jr. made clear that the nonviolent struggle was not over. As St. Paul says in the book of Romans, we are more than conquerors when we engage in a moral struggle. It's not enough to conquer the opposition. In a violent struggle, we are committed to fight until we win our adversaries as friends. As King explained to his Montgomery congregation, the significant thing is that when you follow this way, when the battle is almost over, a new friendship and reconciliation exists between the people who have been the oppressors and the oppressed. This is the end of nonviolent struggle, a new nation, a new world where former enemies become co-laborers for the common good. We can never be friends with our enemies, of course, until they stop trying to destroy us. But even in the midst of a struggle, we can love our enemies. As love seeks understanding, we can learn from them. Sometimes, in fact, they become our most important teachers as we develop tactics for the next stage of battle. An offering to support the mission of this church will now be given and gratefully received. I was born in Chattanooga, Tennessee on June 26, 1964, in the middle of one of the most turbulent decades in American history. 10 months earlier, on August 28, 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous I Have a Dream speech at the Lincoln Memorial. And 7 months earlier, on November 22, 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated. 5 days before I was born, during the so-called Freedom Summer, when more than 700 activists from around the country came to Mississippi to support voter registration for African Americans, 3 of these young civil rights workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, were murdered. The story of their murders and the investigation that followed were the subject of the 1988 film Mississippi Burning. The next spring, on Sunday, March 7th, 1965, when I was 8 months old, Dr. King and the student activist and future Congressman John Lewis led hundreds of marchers across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, as part of the famous Selma to Montgomery March for Voting Rights. That event became known as Bloody Sunday because the marchers were viciously attacked by police and a self-appointed posse of local segregationists. In the days around that march, the 26-year-old black man, Jimmy Lee Jackson, was murdered, and the young Unitarian minister, James Reeb, who had come from Massachusetts to answer Dr. King's call for white church allies, was beaten so severely that he died 2 days later, just 2 among several victims of violence directed at the marchers. And of course, on April 4th, 1968, 2 months before my 4th birthday, Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. And on June 6th, Robert Kennedy was also assassinated. 2 of my earliest vague childhood memories concerning important news on the television. And though legal segregation ended when President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act the year I was born, I can remember asking my parents why there were 2 water fountains in the department stores and in the building where my dentist was located. The signs for whites only and colored were gone, but de facto segregation and racism was still a social reality. The reason I'm speaking about all these historical events of the civil rights movement in the context of my own life story is to make a point about how recently they occurred. I am getting older, but I'm not that old, and all these events happened in my lifetime or shortly before. I'm sure many of you who are a little older than me have even stronger recollections and feelings about these and other important events in the civil rights era. This is not ancient history. For at least a few more decades, there will still be living witnesses who remember. If Dr. King was still alive, he would turn 94 today. One can only imagine the difference he might have made had he lived longer. But perhaps the symbolic significance of his assassination in the years that followed outweighs the loss. Now he too belongs to the ages as a fallen hero of human dignity. Unfortunately, you can be much younger than me and still bear witness to a long list of racially motivated violence in America. It would be wrong to say that we have made no progress on racism and civil rights over the last half century, but racism is still an ugly fact of American society. And even the struggle against voter suppression aimed at blacks and other minorities continues. A few years ago, on March 8th, 2015, I preached about the 50th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March in the First Universalist Parish in Chester, Vermont. It was a day when thousands of people gathered in Selma to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge to commemorate the anniversary, including President Obama, Congressman John Lewis, and Reverend Peter Morales, then president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, along with members of the UA Board of Trustees. I spoke about the Black Lives Matter movement, which was started in 2013 in the wake of the acquittal of George Zimmerman for the murder of the African-American teenager Trayvon Martin. Activists in the black community were fed up with the broken justice system that has so often displayed a callous disregard for black lives, whether it is harassment and the justifiable fear of encounters with police officers, or the assumptions and stereotypes about black men that has led to inequality in incarceration rates, often for relatively minor offenses. I spoke about the young black men and women and even children who were too often killed when confronted by police. The list grows longer each year. Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, Eric Gardner in New York, 12-year-old Tamir Rice in Ohio, and 28-year-old Akai Gurley in New York. And we could name many, many more names. I spoke about the disturbing increase in the number of violent incidents motivated by white nationalism, racism, and anti-Semitism, and the even more disturbing number of right-wing politicians who accept and even encourage political violence through language that is clearly a dog whistle to the extremist or just overt racism that no longer even tries to hide its public face. Another of my childhood TV memories from the 1970s is seeing poorly produced political ads from a local segregationist and white nationalist named J.B. Stoner, who ran for several offices as a Democrat over the span of a few years. With the Confederate battle flag as a backdrop, of course, he would spout his racist and anti-Semitic rhetoric, hoping to rally the faithful. Few people took him seriously back then, and he was considered repulsive, or at least a bad joke, by most of our neighbors, even in the district that is now represented by Marjorie Taylor Greene. These days, I fear he could be serving in Congress right now. Incidentally, Stoner was eventually sentenced to 10 years in prison in 1980 for the 1958 bombing of the Bethel Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. However, despite being a fugitive for a time, once incarcerated, he served only 3.5 years of his sentence before being released. Stoner was also never prosecuted for more than a dozen other bombings for which he was a suspect. When it comes to cases of racism and domestic terrorism, justice has been historically slow and inept. In every corner of America, on any given day, there is discrimination, abuse, and injustice. It is often more subtle today, but sometimes it is just as blatant as it was in the 1960s and impossible to ignore. It is also true that America today is not nearly as segregated as it once was during the time of Jim Crow. And many legal and cultural barriers have fallen. It is now common to see people of all ethnicities in positions of leadership and authority, even the President of the United States, positions of leadership and authority that were hard to even imagine in the 1960s. But we are not there yet. The fight continues. People of goodwill and sacrificial spirit are still marching. I've already mentioned the important public witness of Black Lives Matter, and I also want to highlight the Moral Mondays movement and the Poor People's Campaign, both led by Reverend Dr. William Barber, that I believe represent the most promising and important moral movements in America today. In 2012, in North Carolina, Republican Pat McCrory was elected governor. And Republicans also gained control of the legislature, thanks in part to controversial redistricting plans that blatantly diminished the power of minority voters. And once in power, they began to pass a series of controversial laws that motivated the NAACP and other advocacy groups to take action. Reverend Barber, then president of the state NAACP chapter, organized weekly civil disobedience at the North Carolina State House in protest that became known as the Moral Mondays movement. As a strong and savvy leader, Barber quickly realized the power of what he calls fusion politics to bring groups focused on different but intersectional justice issues together to take advantage of strength in numbers. Environmentalists joined ranks with labor unions, reproductive health advocates, public education activists, LGBTQ+ activists, religious leaders from across the spectrum, and many other groups to find common ground against an immoral agenda. In addition to the weekly protests at the State House, the NAACP's annual march in Raleigh each February, known as the Historic Thousands on Jones Street, or HK on J, grew larger and larger as these fusion political allies joined them. I first became aware of Reverend Barber's movement when I received an email from him through my seminary's alumni network asking for clergy from around the country to come to Raleigh for the HK on J March on February 14th, 2015. I was uncertain about going at first, but something in me began to feel I simply had no choice but to go. It was hard to ignore the comparison to Dr. King's appeal to come to Selma, though I was very aware that I was facing little risk compared to those who dared to answer Dr. King's call. So I bought a plane ticket and arranged to be part of a diverse group of about 30 students, alums, and faculty from my seminary, Andover Newton, some UUs, some Baptist, and others with the United Church of Christ, a few African Americans, men and women, and a couple of LGBTQ ministers. The retiring president of our seminary also joined us. Reverend Barber made a point to meet with us in person the morning of the march, and I immediately knew that he was someone to admire and to listen to. Being part of that march was an amazing experience I will never forget. There were tens of thousands of marchers raising up a host of issues that demanded attention. That HK on J march and the People's Climate March in New York City I attended in 2014 have been the most inspiring examples I have seen that demonstrate the power of motivated people turning out to make their voices heard. Nobody expected the problems to be solved by marching, but they became much harder to ignore. Reverend Barber's most recent projects have been the revitalization of the Poor People's Campaign, which was started by Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1967, and the extension of these efforts into what Barber calls the Third Reconstruction Project. The current form of the Poor People's Campaign has expanded its reach to include the fusion political groups, which came together for Moral Mondays, and has even taken it a step further. A few years ago, for example, the Poor People's Campaign announced a partnership with Al Gore's Climate Reality Project to focus on environmental justice issues that often disproportionately impact poor and minority communities. The Third Reconstruction Project is focused on economic policies that address inequality. As it says on their website, drawing on the transformational history of the first Reconstruction following the Civil War and the second Reconstruction of the civil rights struggles in the 20th century, The third reconstruction is a revival of our constitutional commitment to establish justice, provide for the general welfare, and end decades of austerity, and recognize that policies that center the 140 million poor and low-income people in this country are also good economic policies that can heal and transform the nation. All of these efforts reflect the legacy of Dr. King and the civil rights movement, as people begin to recognize how utterly interconnected we really are, and how important it is to remain steadfast in the fight for justice wherever it leads. In an address titled, "I've Been to the Mountaintop," delivered at the Bishop Charles Mason Temple on April 3rd, 1968, the day before his assassination, Dr. King said, "Somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest for right. And so, just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. We are going on." As Unitarian Universalists, we have a long history of showing up for the good fights, lending our bodies to rallies and marches for causes that reflect our moral foundations. There's far too much wrong with the world for any of us to fix it all. But fortunately, almost any cause we embrace is intersectional. Injustice has a way of spilling over boundaries and spreading harm like some pernicious flood. In the spirit of full disclosure, when it comes to the time and energy I can personally allocate to advocacy and justice work, my heart is primarily focused on the existential crises of climate change and the accelerated loss of biodiversity. But that doesn't mean anti-racism, anti-oppression work is not important to me. It is critical that we find ways to make America a more perfect union that confronts our original sin of slavery once and for all. We can all do something, either as allies or champions, finding a balance in our lives that keeps us from burning out in our desperation. I try to take to heart a quote from the Talmud I have in calligraphy in my office wall. "It is not on you to complete the work, neither are you free to desist from it." I am willing to do my part to fight against racism, knowing that I can rely on the passion of others for whom anti-racism activism is their central concern. It is important that we listen to these people and lend our support. There are leaders like Reverend Barber who have picked up where Dr. King left off. And it is especially hopeful to see the passion, acceptance, and leadership displayed by America's youth and young adults. I believe their generation could be the one to fulfill Dr. King's dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I too have a dream as someone who grew up on those red hills of Georgia. My dream is that the march for injustice will strengthen and continue until the day it is no longer needed. There is tremendous work to be done, battles to refight, and setbacks to endure. But I have to believe the words of Theodore Parker, made famous by Dr. King, that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. May it be so. I now invite you to rise in body or spirit once again and join us in singing our closing hymn, number 170. We are a gentle, angry people.
We are gay and straight together, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a gentle, loving people, and we are singing, singing for our lives. We are a gentle, loving people, and we are singing, singing for our lives.
Our closing words are adapted from the Reverend William Sinkford, former president of the UUA. We are a gentle and generous people, but let us not forget our anger. May it fuel not only our commitment to compassion, but also our commitment to make fundamental changes. Our vision of the beloved community must stand against a vision that would allow the privilege of the few to be accepted as just and even holy. Our religious vision must once again ask, who is my neighbor? And strive always to include more and more of us. As we intone the words that gave birth to this nation, we the people, we are and should be both a gentle and an angry people.
Please join me in extinguishing our chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Please join us downstairs for refreshments after the postlude.